Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, is one of the most peculiar fascinations in American history. He oftentimes is only brung up when someone is at a trivia trying to answer the classic question, what president was the only president to be elected to two terms non-consecutively? And up until recently, it was Grover Cleveland, but also now Donald Trump has taken the mantle, which has led to a lot of people saying that Grover Cleveland has lost his uniqueness in American history, but I couldn't disagree more. Grover Cleveland may be one of the most unknown figures in American history, especially to modern audiences, but in my opinion, he is one of the most heroic figures in American history, and I think an example for all future presidents to emulate if they wish to govern in a manner that captures the essence and ethos of our republic. So, in this video, we will be exploring the virtuous legacy of Grover Cleveland, one of my favorite presidents, and we'll be going over his terms in office, and we'll be actually identifying what makes Grover Cleveland such a heroic person within the canons of conservatism, and why you, as a modern person, should also admire him as well. Before we get into that, friends, hope you're doing well. I'm Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to help us get this channel successful. Even if you disagree with me, my friends, we are almost at 20,000 subscribers. I'm so excited. If you enjoy watching content that makes you think, if you enjoy watching content that explores uncommon angles to modern problems, if you enjoy watching content that will help you get to the heart of the matter, as the great Don Henley said in his song, of the issues that we face right now in our society, then please give me a subscription, give me a comment, give me a like. I think that this content will help you do all those things. Thank you guys so much, and now please enjoy the video. So, Grover Cleveland, born Stephen Grover Cleveland, was a man that didn't have a really impressive background. He was a man born to a Presbyterian minister. As he grew up, he eventually became an elected official, became a sheriff in New York State, and became a lawyer as well, and then eventually became the mayor of Buffalo in New York, and then also eventually became the governor of New York State, all within a very, very short period of time. But what he is known for the most, he is known for his tenure as both the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States, which we will explore in a moment. But the reason I say that Grover Cleveland is virtuous, and this will become more apparent as the video goes on, is because he is one of the few political figures in American history to base his political calculations solely upon principles, no matter what or who it offended. And his policy decisions, both as governor and as president, actually reflect this. As governor, for example, Theodore Roosevelt, who was actually a member of the New York State Legislature, he wasn't quite the president quite yet, but he would eventually become one of the leading figures in the progressive era, was actually pushing Grover Cleveland to extend the government into private enterprise, to regulate trains, and to regulate tenures in office and things of that sort. And there were a lot of different things that Theodore Roosevelt and his faction would push into Cleveland's desk. And Cleveland was known, both as governor and as president, for being willing to veto more than he was willing to sign. Now, this may seem like a rather unexceptional action. Every president has the ability to veto, so why should this be a mark for Cleveland? Very simply because being willing to veto more than you're willing to sign reflects a certain attitude about A, the nature of power, and B, how power should exist within the context of the American constitutional republic. And it was this mentality that I think makes Grover Cleveland a great president and allowed him to withstand a lot of the hardships and trials that he had to endure in both of his terms. It should also be very important to point out that Grover Cleveland and Theodore Roosevelt actually had quite a few clashes. There's a story that says that Roosevelt was upset about a few of Grover Cleveland's vetoes. So he stormed to the governor's office and began screaming at him. And Grover Cleveland was very steadfast that if the bill that came into his desk was morally correct, he would sign it. But if it wasn't correct, he would not sign it. But he would listen to his opponents, and he would offer a counterpoint. And Roosevelt didn't like that very much, and they had a very tense relationship, although they ended up being friends, as the historian John M. Pafford notes in his book about Grover Cleveland. So, before we get into his presidency and showing the virtue that he undertook there, we have to realize the world that Grover Cleveland existed in. It actually was a very different political climate than our current world today. In Grover Cleveland's time, we didn't have fiat money. In other words, we didn't have money backed by only the full faith and credit of its creditors. We had actual sound money backed by the gold standard. On the international stage, we didn't have a NATO or United Nations to guide America's foreign policy. On the international stage, there were three primary empires. There was the British Empire, the Union Jack flew in a lot of places. There was the French Empire, which was behind the British Empire. There was a Japan, which was beginning to expand, but hadn't quite done so. And then, most importantly, there was Germany that would eventually become a tangible threat to the United States. And Cleveland actually dealt with them in a manner that preserved peace, as opposed to stoking war. Today, if that were to happen, as we have seen from recent foreign policy decisions, our leaders would do their best to stoke war as opposed to preserve peace. But there was no NATO, no UN, no international world order. There was these empires, and then there was the cradle and embodiment of the new world that is America. There weren't many major policy differences between Democrats and Republicans. In fact, it was more so a matter of variations. In Cleveland's day, in the late 19th century, 1800s, 1870s, the Democrats and the Republicans didn't fight very much on policy. In fact, when Grover Cleveland ran against Benjamin Harrison after his first term, both of them were quite conservative. Although Benjamin Harrison supported a stronger form of tariff. Back then, and we'll get into tariffs in a second, back then tariffs were the mode of funding, and Grover Cleveland supported a very low, and in some cases non-existent form of tariff. That would be normally where the battle would come down upon. Now, eventually, once the Democratic Party matured, once the Progressive Era happened and Woodrow Wilson came along, and then once Franklin Delano Roosevelt came along in the 1930s, the Democratic Party would change for the worst and become this kind of progressive haven. But in Cleveland's day, it was actually a conservative party led by what is called by historians the Bourbon Democrats, this kind of small government, sound money, fiscally conservative Democrats that you wouldn't really see today in the Democratic Party. You didn't have institutional leftism the way we have it today. Because today we have institutional leftism penetrating every corner of the media. We have it penetrating every corner of the Democratic Party. It is very pervasive. Back then, the left didn't even have a home in the Democratic Party. It had a home in the sort of fringe third parties, like the Populist Party, that advocated the nationalization of industry and advocated inflationary policy for money. It didn't really have a strong hold on the national stage. Government spending was low compared to today. There was no Federal Reserve, so monetary policy was actually set by the Congress and the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve. There was no education bureaucracy. There was no powerful intelligence agencies. Now, there was the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Those of you students of history may know about this. But it was founded by Alan Pinkerton, and it was particularly useful to the Union during the Civil War to surveil and disrupt Confederate spy efforts. But the Union, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, to the extent that it lived beyond the Civil War, became a tool for certain private interests to brutalize people they didn't like. So, for example, the Pinkerton Detective Agency became very known for strike breaking, going out and attacking people who were engaged in worker strikes. And by the way, I don't support worker strikes, and Grover Cleveland had some opinions about that as well, because I fundamentally believe that you can move your labor wherever you want, and you need not make the person that is willingly employing you suffer because of your indecision or whatever. But having said that, you don't have the right to then therefore attack and physically injure people. So the Pinkerton Detective Agency was actually reprimanded by Congress for doing that, and the formal ties between them up until the mid-20th century and the United States government were effectively severed. Can you imagine Congress severing ties between an intelligence agency today? No, of course you can't. There was a booming economy. Brands like Quaker Oats and Coca-Cola were just beginning to emerge. Western Union, which people now like to go to get money transfers, back then was extending thousands of miles of telegraph lines across the country, transcending and challenging space and time to connect Americans via the communication system. In other words, Grover Cleveland presided over an era of unprecedented change, where who was in the presidency could have had an immense impact on the future of the nation. So, as his first term began, his virtues also began to emerge. So first of all, Grover Cleveland's virtue is found first in his defiance of the special interest. Grover Cleveland, whether he was governor of New York, fighting against Tammany Hall, which was the major political machine, which had done a lot of very immoral stuff in New York State, or whether it be as president, he never bowed to the special interest. In fact, in most cases, he just thumbed his nose at them, and he would excoriate them either through veto messages given to Congress or through other means given through one of his secretaries. And one big rejection of special interests would be how he treated the issue of pensions. Now, in his day, and during his first term, there was a group of pensioners called the Grand Army of the Republic. They were a pension special interest group that lobbied for pensions for Civil War veterans. But this group lobbied for pensions not just for the Civil War veterans, but they lobbied for pensions that had no oversight over them. And because of this, the amount of pensions that had been issued since the Civil War, which is like 1865, Grover Cleveland came in like 1880s, early 1880s, had actually surged by a lot. Now you would think the further you get from the war, the more the pensions would go down. But no. There was so much waste, fraud, and abuse, and there was such an aura around the issue of pensions that if you were a congressperson and you voted against, because back then they voted against or for someone getting a pension, they didn't have the VA or something we have right now. If you voted against someone getting a pension, you were considered to be an enemy of veterans, and that was basically political catastrophe for you. So Grover Cleveland came in and said, I'm going to veto most of the pension claims that come to my desk with my pen, because most of them are simply taking advantage of a system that has far outgrown its intended purpose. And for this, the Grand Army of the Republic got angry at him, they shook their fists at him, they saber-rattled, but he stood strong on principle to defend the pension system. To give you some numbers, when Cleveland first took office in 1885, there were 345,000 veterans or family members or deceased veterans receiving pensions in the United States. This would have been $65.5 million in his day, would have been $1.6 billion in modern dollars. So that was actually 1/4 of the federal government's spending. So it didn't shrink, it instead surged. And so by vetoing all of those requests, Cleveland actually ensured that the pension system would be preserved and protected from those that would seek to take advantage of it. Now, there's another part that he did that was actually quite anathema to special interest, and that is the Texas Seed Bill. The Texas Seed Bill was one of the first formal forms of federal disaster relief. Now, in our day, the idea of having federal disaster relief is a no-brainer because we have FEMA and we have all these different funds. It's actually just thought of as a common thing. When the people are in trouble, the government should be there to help, which is a fallacy, but that's what most Americans believe. But in Cleveland's day, that wasn't a guarantee. And upon the logic of believing that a good society, a flourishing society, is going to have a character that allows them to self-govern and the component of self-governance, self-maintain, independent of political power, led him to veto the Texas Seed Bill. Now, a lot of farmers were upset about that because they had lost their crops in droughts and they wanted money to recoup those damages. A lot of what we call the agricultural industry was upset about that. But Cleveland, in response to his veto, said the following, and this actually reflects his commitment to principle. He said, and I quote, "I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadfastly resisted to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced, that the people should support the government. The government should not support the people. And upon this bedrock of basic American constitutionalism and self-governance, he built his entire presidency. You can imagine the hate he got. Someone called William Jennings Bryan, who eventually became a very pivotal figure in the United States, in United States history, saber out against Cleveland on so many different issues and claimed that Cleveland was in the pocket of corporate interest for doing certain things that ostensibly benefited those interests, even though he did them for the sake of defending principles. But Cleveland also opposed protectionism, which is a pretty popular idea these days, and you guys can have your own opinion on it, I don't mind, but Cleveland thought and knew, as did most Americans that day, that tariffs, if they are way too high, can not only raise prices, but have a negative impact on the consumer's ability to choose what products they want to choose. Cleveland believed that even though tariffs were a necessary evil, there should be a bunch of different things like wood or other kind of materials exempted from tariffs, and they should be as low as possible. Now, back in those days, 60% of federal funding came from tariffs. But the other percentage came from taxes on tobacco and taxes on whiskey. So Cleveland himself didn't like either. And the idea of having a tax on any kind of income was also anathema to them, although unfortunately his second term would result in the introduction of the first peacetime income tax, which he was kind of strong-armed into accepting. We'll get to that in a second. But he sought to keep tariffs low, which made some American producers quite angry. So in all those instances, he stood up against special interests regardless of the political cost. But most importantly, he also defended sound money. He kept America hinged into the gold standard during his first term. And during his second term, he used the gold standard to actually reverse the economic catastrophes that had happened under his successor, Benjamin Harrison, which we'll also get to in a second. But most importantly, I think for Grover Cleveland is that he understood that the government itself should be staffed with people that are there not based on nepotism, not based on connections, but that are instead there based on their accomplishments. In other words, he was a champion of meritocracy, which is why during his first term, he enforced and extended the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which helped undermine what is called the spoils system. The spoils system was basically how people from the early 1820s all the way towards Cleveland's term were selected for political positions. They were selected on the basis of who they were friends with, who they know, not what they know, and it's entirely a matter of whose circle you get into. Well, Cleveland believed that this kind of system defied the meritocracy America was built upon. It defied the pursuit of excellence, and it only led to political factionalism and political favors, as opposed to being conducive to the actual purpose of what government should be doing, which is serving the people. So he literally extended this act, and by doing that, he forestalled and effectively got rid of the spoils system and returned a sort of meritocratic approach to hiring. Now, he did allow some kind of spoils-like hires to be hired for very low levels of government, because he recognized that when you're trying to administer a government, you have to have people that are loyal to you. And by the way, he had no problem with that. He staffed his cabinet with loyal people that had his vision, but he also understood that loyalty should not be the primary consideration. Merit should come before that. And as president, he very much did that. As president, Cleveland protected the American Indians. He made it very clear by way of executive order and by way of his own influence that the American Indians should be allowed to live on their lands that had been agreed about, and there should be no poaching and no overextension. So in other words, he had a very deep respect for the American Indians that I think for a very long time in America, those same constituencies that felt like the government did not at all respect. Foreign policy-wise, there were two very interesting things that happened during his first term. First would have been the Samoa dispute. So, essentially in Samoa, which was not yet now American Samoa, we eventually took it over. But back then, Samoa was its own self-governing institution. And you had the British Empire dominant, the French Empire ascendant, and the German Empire ascendant. And this is when I mentioned how Germany became a threat to the American hemisphere. Germany tried to essentially seize Samoa. Cleveland intervened, not by saber rallying, but by first trying to seek out peace. Germany essentially subverted this effort, went into Samoa, and installed their puppet into the government. So in response to this, Cleveland sent naval boats to stare down German boats, which inspired the Samoans to overthrow Germany. Now, the important thing about this and why it's so virtuous is because Cleveland essentially had this mentality that two things as it relates to foreign policy are bad. Number one, entangling alliances. America's interest should first be the interests of the people of the country, not the interests of other countries. And number two, and most importantly, expansionism. America need not expand, it must maintain. He was a conservative in the strictest sense by believing that the borders we had at that point in time should remain our borders and should remain the duty of every American to maintain. He did not believe in going around and trying to impose America's ideas upon other people. He simply wished to cultivate a permanent home for America's ideas, and his approach to foreign policy 110% respected that. During his first term as well, there was a dispute that happened in Canada between fishing boats. In the North Atlantic near Canada, there was conflict over territories. And this conflict almost provoked a war with the British Empire, but Cleveland actually managed to, again, negotiate and settle this out in a manner that kept the global peace alive. So his approach here, again, needs to be emphasized on heavily. Because a lot of people in our modern time will say that if you seek out peace before you seek out war, you seek out negotiation, and you don't even saber rattle immensely, you're some kind of ostrich, you're some kind of coward. When in all reality, it takes much more strength, in my opinion, to wade through a complex issue and to bring together the mutually distinct interests of everyone in that issue and then arrive at an outcome than it takes to go ahead and get a bomb and drop it somewhere. Strength, people have this idea, peace through strength. Well, when strength effectively means going ahead and forcing your enemies or forcing your opponents, rather, to do your bidding at your behest at the barrel of a gun, that's not very strong. That's a cowardly way of doing foreign policy. And Cleveland did the exact opposite thing. Now, unfortunately, William McKinley and people that came after him would go in and they would begin to expand. They would be more interventionist and they would set the groundwork for what eventually became the League of Nations, then set the groundwork for what became the United Nations and NATO, and it became a more dominant role for America in the world, which just didn't exist in the time of Cleveland. Now, he lost his election to Benjamin Harrison. Harrison comes in. Harrison effectively crashes the economy. How did Harrison crash the economy? Harrison crashed the economy by trying to maintain an alliance between two factions of people that existed within the Republican Party at that time. There was one faction of people that wanted to have a policy called the free silver policy. And this is essentially the policy where the basically advocated a monetary policy where there would be an unlimited supply of silver produced, a sort of inflationary policy where silver would just continue to get coined and it would become the dominant currency. Now, the issue with this is that it causes inflation. And then there were other people within Harrison's own party who wished to maintain the idea of bimetallism. Bimetallism was simply this economic mechanism by which the amount of gold and the amount of silver was fixed to a ratio by the government, a ratio that was different than market value, and then that was used in terms of currency. Now, the problem with this is that when market value differs from the value that the government artificially imposes upon something, this causes an overvaluation. And silver was fixed at a value higher than market value, and silver was therefore overvalued, which led to inflationary pressures. So, the culmination of all this, which, by the way, the solution to this was somehow the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which essentially said, okay, let's forget the idea of bimetallism, and we're going to instead just increase the coinage of silver. So they're going to increase the amount of silver the government can purchase, and we can make that amount of silver redeemable in gold bonds, in gold. Now, what happened? Since silver was a very unstable currency and gold was the stable and sound currency, people bought a lot of silver, then redeemed it in gold, and the gold reserves dropped. And so this made people begin to panic, and companies began going under. Railroad companies began going under, and when Cleveland entered his second term, the Panic of 1893, which he is wrongly blamed with, began. And so, funnily enough, this short episode and bad monetary policy should be rather a lesson to our current economic managers that do a lot of the same things that the people in the free silver movement and the bimetallist movement wanted to happen, but it unfortunately isn't. And so just to recap, the Treasury was buying basically an unlimited inflationary amount of silver, redeeming it in gold. Gold was limited, silver was not limited. The farmers and the people in the mining industries that were mining silver wanted this kind of silver expansionary policy. The Populist Party wanted it, leftists wanted it. This was all to end the depletion of the gold reserves, and this was a big contributor to the Panic of 1893. Now, Cleveland essentially, and during his second term, reversed the major effects of the Panic by doing a few things. Number one, he repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Number two, he essentially insisted upon using the gold standard no matter what. And it got to a point where there were his own Democratic conference in the United States legislature was resisting his willingness to only use gold. Now, Cleveland had no problem with silver, but silver, he believed, should have been subsidiary to gold. It should not have been a big thing that's invested in. So eventually, the House stops approving the issuance of gold bonds to the Treasury. And now Cleveland, if he was not principled, would have been essentially forced into purchasing more silver and indulging in an inflationary policy like so many people wanted him to do. What did he do? He essentially turned to the private sector, turned to J.P. Morgan, and had them begin selling bonds to the federal government. And through this kind of intuitive thinking, he reversed the major problem. Now, the panic was still felt into like the last end of the decade, but he reversed the major problems of the Panic of 1893 by returning and insisting upon sound money. He defeated the Silverites, he defeated their unsound policies, and he anchored us back down to a sound economic system. Now, why is this important? It's particularly important because sound policy, when divorced from a sound philosophical foundation, cannot be sound policy. It is the antithesis of sound policy. And which is why a lot of people, when they try to distinguish between philosophical debate and policy debate, actually get it wrong. Because if you have a policy without a sound philosophical foundation, you have a policy that is rooted in nothing more than the prevailing interests of the time. And as time changes, interests can change, and the application of power can change, and therefore your policy is on a foundation of sand, not on solid stone. But not only that, if you have no overarching philosophical system, how can you tell if your policy accords with reality? Well, it's really difficult because you can't. You have no metric beyond the temporal space upon which you're acting. And so in other words, philosophy allows us to look extrinsically away from our circumstances and see the bigger picture, whereas policy debates by themselves only concern what we can immediately see before us. And Cleveland understood this principle and used it to essentially rescue the American economy the best way he could with a resistant House and Senate against him. Cleveland also responded decisively when the Pullman workers' strike happened. Now, the Pullman workers' strike essentially happened because as the panic went on, there was a lot of souring labor relationships in America. A lot of labor unions were actually pretty upset. The workers, particularly at the Pullman company, were especially upset for a few reasons. Number one, they were upset because they believed that their requirement, they had to, if they were going to work for that company, they had to live in the towns made by that company. They thought that was onerous. But then they also had to shop at the stores made by the company, which they thought the prices were too high. So they did not believe they were being compensated enough. And as the panic happened, their wages did not rise, but the prices of the goods that they purchased did rise. So essentially the Pullman workers began to strike. And a man who would become, I think, a fascination in American history emerged during this time. His name is Eugene Debs. Now, Debs kind of took advantage of the tensions of workers, and he used it to motivate them to do even more strikes. Debs did not push for violence, but many of these strikes ended up being violent. So much so that one of the strikes involved a bunch of workers overtaking a mail train. There were people who died, and Cleveland, in response to that, had no problem declaring martial law, having his attorney general issue an injunction against the strikes, and going in when the riotous workers did not want to behave. In other words, Cleveland believed in a self-governing populace, but he saw no problem having a decisive response to those who would seek to harm civil society by their antics. This is another example of the virtue that I think Cleveland had. Now, during his second term, his foreign policy was even more interesting because he resisted war in 3 hot conflicts. Number one, Hawaii. There was an active attempt by forces in the United States to encourage the annexation of Hawaii, which would eventually, by the way, come true, unfortunately. But Cleveland himself, when these calls were being made, as opposed to bowing to the special interest, did what he normally did. He said, no, I want to actually see what's going on. So he actually sent someone to investigate the conditions of Hawaii, especially as related to American involvement, because President Benjamin Harrison before him actively pushed for that. And when he found out that there not only was there a misuse of American power, he essentially withdrew an annexation treaty of Hawaii and negotiated with the Queen, whose name I cannot pronounce, but you'll see here up on your screen, and essentially restored her back to power. Unfortunately, again, after Cleveland left office, Hawaii would become annexed, but he did not believe in the idea of expansionism. Again, he believed in conserving what we had as Americans, not in bringing more people into the fold who did not want to be brought into the fold necessarily. Cleveland adhered to the Monroe Doctrine and strictly believed that the hemisphere that America is in should be free from any foreign influence and the states within that hemisphere should be able to self-govern. So when the British came to Venezuela and attempted to extend their influence there, Cleveland was rather bellicose. He threatened them. He was really muscular. But eventually, he stopped the British from expanding into Venezuela, and he essentially protected the integrity of the Western Hemisphere. Again, reflecting this principle that, yes, I don't like expansionism, but I do believe there is a sphere of influence that directly affects America, and that sphere is near America. It's not thousands of miles away. I'm going to fight to defend this sphere. And then the last conflict that Cleveland dealt with during his second term was in Cuba. There was a revolution being led by someone called Jose Marti, and there was a conflict between the Cubans and the Spanish. Cleveland remained neutral in the conflict and did not seek to, again, insert America's own perspective into it. Now, during this uprising in Cuba between Spain and the Cuban revolutionaries led by Jose Marti, there was destruction of American property. And when that happened, the House of Representatives passed a massive measure to give Cleveland the authority to go in and essentially take belligerent action and intervene in Cuba. But Cleveland did not help the rebels. He did not go in. He simply ignored the resolution, and the conflict didn't go away, but it was no longer a problem for him. So again, normally when people are given such free rein, even if they're not given free rein, even if they have to concoct some kind of way, like Barack Obama saying that I'll go to the UN or NATO to go to and do a belligerent action overseas. The nature of power is that it will always find a way to get around procedural hoops if it is determined, but Cleveland reflected the kind of character one should have when dealing with power, that you tame it, it does not tame you. He understood his duty to Americans, and he understood his duty to the Constitution, and he understood the purpose of the power of going to war, and he exercised it never and was quite frugal when he considered it. That, again, reflects a very good virtue. Now, Cleveland's view towards civil society, I think, reflects his virtue even more than his refusal to buy into special interest or the 414 vetoes that he had, which was more than his predecessors, several of them put together combined, or his willingness to stay out of foreign wars. I think what's really good about Cleveland is that he believed that a free society, one in which individuals could exercise their free will in a manner conducive to their conscience, must still have moral guardrails to it. And now the question always becomes, what are those moral guardrails? For Cleveland, he rooted those moral guardrails in his understanding, his Protestant understanding of Christianity. And there's no better reflection of this than in his attitude towards polygamy. So, back in the 19th century, Utah didn't quite yet exist until the very end of the 19th century, back until 1896. And Cleveland received an application for statehood from the Mormon Mormons from Latter-day Saints who were a pretty, they were still a growing contingent of Christians in the country at the time, and eventually they got their own state. And he particularly used that application as an opportunity to go to Congress and condemn polygamy. Here is what Cleveland actually said in his first annual message to Congress in December 8, 1885 about the issue of the connection between civil society and moral strength. He said, quote, "The strength, the perpetuity, and the destiny of our nation rest upon our homes, established by the law of God, guarded by parental care, regulated by parental authority, and sanctified by parental love. These are not the homes of polygamy." So you can imagine that in the modern day sense, Cleveland would have been a major supporter of parental rights, which have come under assault by the institutional left that believe that children, in their theory, are victims of a society that infantilizes them and that they instead should be able to express themselves in all kind of self-destructive ways. Well, Cleveland's saying, no, the bedrock of a good society is one in which parental care is emphasized and parental authority and love combine to incubate good people for the society, to incubate productive members of the society. Now, his more controversial part here is that the polygamy was anathema to this. So what ended up happening is the Mormons had to renounce polygamy, and after that they got statehood and they got Utah. Now, what's very interesting is, regardless if you agree with his Christian perspective or not, Cleveland recognized that you cannot simply have, again, a society where license is the only standard by which to judge its moral quality. You must have a society where virtuous behavior is actually undertaken beyond license. In other words, it's not simply a society of permissiveness. It's also a society of moral duty and, most importantly, of moral limitations. Now, within the natural law tradition, which is the tradition that I am personally a student of, there's all kinds of different arguments about if polygamy, bigamy, or any of those kind of untraditional arrangements are actually okay, and there are arguments for and against. I'm not here to comment on that. But in the context of Cleveland, his moral clarity on this issue and his recognition, at least of some of the basic principles of what makes civil society tick, is what makes him a powerful president. Because once you acknowledge the basic to civil society, your mind towards power will then have civil society in mind, which will naturally, when you have the right understanding, restrain you from doing certain things and instead promote a vigorous and energetic citizenry that can do things without the paternalism of the government. In fact, Cleveland himself condemns paternalism several times because he understands the social principle. This is a virtue, because he understands that society is conserved in the best way, not by authority, but by the willing consent of the people. But that doesn't mean he needs to be morally agnostic about everything. It does mean, however, that as president, his job is not to use the law as a tool to promote certain kinds of behavior, but it is to express the limits upon which the law should go in order to maintain a moral, free society, which is absolutely wonderful. Now, another aspect of Cleveland's virtue was actually in his views around race, which aren't really talked about a lot. Now, and a lot of people actually criticize him for this. So Cleveland did not believe in the inferiority of the black race. In fact, he believed that non-white races deserved the same kind of rights as whites had. However, Cleveland was constrained by the political considerations of his time, because the Democratic Party, which he was a part of, the old school Democratic Party, had a lot of people down in the South that they were trying to maintain a constituency on. And in the South, the treatment of blacks was not very good, and there was a certain perspective that was predominant. But Cleveland did not let that political reality constrain his decency. He met with Frederick Douglass and had nothing but nice things to say about Mr. Douglass. And Mr. Douglass also had nothing but nice things to say about Grover Cleveland. Cleveland's honesty, his generosity, and his willingness to see people as who they are, as individuals, endowed with potential, endowed with creative will, endowed with reason, endowed with all these different value systems and value metrics, was exceptional, especially in that time when racism was still very much a problem. We're talking about the 1880s, still very much a problem. Slavery had just been abolished like a decade or so before this time. And yet he had a decency that transcended all of that historical and the temporal madness of his time. But I must also say something about Cleveland as well, is that he did not believe in using the government, as I mentioned, as an evangelizing moral force. In other words, He did not use the government to go into the South or go into areas where blacks may have had a very hard time to fix that through force of law. This would eventually become the modus operandi of the progressives of the 1960s and 1950s through court rulings and through the Civil Rights Act to try to fix racism. Cleveland didn't believe in that because Cleveland fundamentally believed, again, that civil society should be self-governing and that the role of the people, if they're going to become generous and they're going to become correct in their thinking, it must happen organically through them. So he did not use his government as a tool to promote anything, to promote the harm towards black people or to promote an agenda against them of inferiority. He simply remained neutral legally, but personally and socially had a very open mentality towards things that may not have had an open mentality in his day. That's a virtue. Even if some people may have said, well, he didn't go as far enough as he should have. Because one of his predecessors, Ulysses S. Grant, actually went into the South and rounded up the Klansmen with the Klan Acts and persecuted them for what they did. And some may laud that as the example of virtue for that time. But we should also understand that Grant, by doing that, suspended habeas corpus, one of the most important rights of recourse within the American legal canon, which literally allows people to challenge a wrongful detention, which is at the basis of the American political order, being able to challenge authority and be skeptical. And so Grant did something, but he did something at the expense of principle. What made Cleveland different from his predecessors is that he was not willing to sacrifice principle almost ever to get something done. Even when news about his affair came out, he had an affair with a woman, and there was rumors, we don't really know, but he had a love child to her. We don't really know if that's his child or not. Historians are kind of iffy about it. We don't know. But when that came out, he said, tell the truth to his surrogates, and his surrogates told the truth. And it didn't look good, but ultimately, his integrity remained intact. Sometimes when fighting on the solid ground of principle, Cleveland's example shows us you may not necessarily get to where you want to get in the quickest way, but you will ultimately keep yourself intact long enough to get there without being overly wounded or without being sold out on your way getting there. Because if you arrive at a destination in a sold out, wounded way where you have no credibility, you can no longer effect that situation in a manner that you could have if the social capital you had depleted being a liar had been preserved for honesty. There's always a reason to maintain principle, even if it does not seem advantageous to you in the short term, because ultimately it will allow you to order your actions in a manner that is most respectable to reason and to what is right. Now, there's some stuff in here that I haven't gone over. There's a lot of things I haven't gone over, but I've essentially given you a pretty comprehensive overview of the two terms that Cleveland had in office, 22nd, 24th president. As we close, I want you all to think about how many times you have heard people try to say that a particular policy has to happen because to go against it is unrealistic, or there's not the votes for an alternative, or the common denominator is in favor of it, or everyone supports X, Y, or Z. Then I want you to think a few hundred years back into the past and think about how that kind of idea would have been taken by men like Cleveland. Then I want you to think, why can't we have more men like Cleveland who are honest, who buck special interest, who are sound and sober when it comes to the potentiality of war, who respect their citizens, who understand the government is not there to take care of society. Society is simply there to be protected by the government in a very limited sense. Why can't we have that kind of president now? Think about these things. Because the example left by Grover Cleveland should really have all Americans asking the question, what in the world went wrong and how can we right the ship? Now I can give you half of the answer. After Cleveland left office, the progressives took over the Democratic Party, and it became the party of left-wing ideology. It became the party of egalitarianism. It became the party of Prussian-style expertise. It became the party that essentially said society is not there to be even guarded. It's there to be managed. It became a party of so many of these different European ideas that actually came from the German Empire that Cleveland sought to protect American sphere from and wormed its way into our institutions. So in other words, they did win, but they won in the long run, which is a very important thought for many of you to reflect on. But Cleveland's 2 terms reflect a kind of virtue, a kind of wisdom, a kind of common sense, a kind of honesty, a kind of good character, a kind of commitment to principles over political realities or political pursuit, expediency, that I think if more politicians had that mentality, we'd be a much healthier country, a much more philosophically consistent country. We have a much better government. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to get this message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive.